to kick off this panel, I just wanted to give a brief introduction of all the transformation that's been going on in just the last year in the studio space. So as you know, we've seen some major studio consolidation in literally just the last year. 2 of the largest studios in town have merged with other studios. We have Disney that acquired Fox just recently, and most recently, CBS just acquired Viacom. And this is, really monumental for a variety of reasons. It obviously is showing the power positions of the studios again, kind of taking on the tech industries, taking on the Netflixes of the world, and the folks like Apple that are getting into the content game. We've also seen just recently the announcement of so many new streaming platforms that are coming to market in this year, with Disney Plus leading the way. I think they're set to launch in November. So we have also the Warner streaming media platform that's called HBO Max. Peacock was recently announced, and that's NBCU's streaming platform. We also have Discovery and BBC have a streaming platform coming out. So many options for consumers, so much interest in the studio's library content. And also what I've seen is a rise in digital studios that are focusing on really niche content for specific audiences. One of the good examples we have of that is Brat here. As we've mentioned, they're targeted to a Gen Z audience, so if you're not familiar with them, it's because you're not the demo, but they're extremely popular, and you'll hear more about them. 2 other examples happen to be clients of mine. One is Tastemade. They focus on food and cooking type content. Another example is Donut Media. They focus on automotive content only. They have really engaged fans, a really committed audience. So it's a really exciting time in the studio space with so many changes going on. So I wanted to kick off our conversation here with talking about production and how production has changed for creating content for these streaming platforms versus the olden days, maybe broadcast and cable TV. So what do you guys think? I'll kick it off to perhaps Jonathan to talk about your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Tracey. I think we're definitely at a point where studios are needing to produce content under a number of different standard rubrics. One of the functions that my team at CBS plays is standards and practices, better known as the death of all fun. And we've gone through a bit of a transformation with the growth of our streaming platform, CBS All Access. So, with broadcast standards, we've evolved from the point of the old Dick Van Dyke show with 2 beds, and you can't show anybody sitting on a bed with their feet off the floor, obviously to a more progressive space in broadcast. And if you look at shows like The Good Wife or some of the Stephen Bochco shows, NYPD Blue broke a lot of ground on broadcast, but we're now seeing a space where the standards are different. What I think is important to remember is that doesn't mean that the standards rule book has been completely thrown out. It's just a more nuanced challenge, because in a lot of instances, if you take our platform, for example, CBS All Access, it's still CBS branded. And that means we have a certain reputation to maintain, a certain audience expectation and advertiser expectation that we need to clear to. It's certainly not as restrictive as broadcast, but it's also not as unrestricted as you might have on a premium platform. My guess is we're going to start to see the same, for example, with Disney Plus. Disney Plus is going to be a huge aggregator of content. That's very much their model, that for $7 you can pretty much get a lot of everything. I think the challenge that they're going to face in some respect is their historic brand consciousness as a company. They've been conservative in some of their content choices, where anything is carrying the Disney brand. So I think that'll be a little bit of a challenge for them, trying to move into this new space, take the reins off and not clear to a broadcast standard, but at the same time be sensitive to their historical audience and the brand that sits on top of their new streaming service.
And what about Clint? I'll kick it over to you. Producing content for a mobile-first audience, what have you seen in terms of, changes and how we're producing content for that space?
Sure. So we operate under different standards than Jonathan or some more of the traditional studios in the sense that we're more producing for our platforms and kind of their rules, and then of course like our own brand standards. So we're kind of complying with any of my company mostly distributes on YouTube. That's where our content lives first, and then we're on some AVOD platforms, but we're YouTube first for the most part as of now. And so we're operating under the platforms, standards, and then our own kind of consistent brand things, because our world, pardon, it's a bit confusing in the sense, but we have a kind of a Marvel type world where all of our shows exist in 2 towns, and we have a lot of overlap between all of our cast, and which helps with our bottom line in terms of production costs. But yeah, and we shoot everything for the most part in our own studios, and we have a writer's room and own everything outright. So our costs, our founder is proud to say that we're about $3,500 a minute versus a traditional TV show about $25K a minute. So our margin there is different, but for us, it's more about kind of the storyline and our audience and making content for them, as opposed to necessarily anything that's going to win any awards or kind of get attention outside of our demographic. So we're audience first and then platform kind of second, if that makes sense.
And we're going to show a sizzle reel here to give you an idea of what the Brat content, what the Brat audience looks like. I'm sure some of your kids may be watching these shows on the regular. Stand by for technical difficulties.
We're lucky this isn't a Gen Z audience.
They would have walked out the door. They would have had no patience.
Today's episode of the Bill Simmons Podcast, my daughter is here.
There's this show that's like kind of a YouTube show revolved around YouTubers my age, and I've been like kind of obsessed.
What's this show called?
It's an entire thing called Brat.
Let's watch.
We're the chicken girls. Always. What they don't know is, sometimes I still live on the moon.
He's really good.
He's not racing. How was that your decision?
This is really beautiful.
Not as beautiful as you are.
You go in there and you find that boy and you dance your heart out.
You want to take boxing seriously, you're going to have to make the gym your priority.
You are about to see something truly remarkable, astounding, and amazing.
Come on, bring it in.
I'll give you the secrets of crown make I wish I'd known.
You'll love everything about me.
Awesome. So I'll stick with you, Clint. Talking about this elusive Gen Z audience, we've heard so much about the millennials and creating content to capture their attention, and millennials, everything. But now we've got the next generation, Gen Z, who's gonna, take their place. What are they most interested in? What are you guys focused on when you're creating content for them?
Sure. So just so everyone knows, because I know all of these terms kind of are a bit elusive, but Gen Z is between ages 7 and 24, so mid-90s and then onward. But what the studies show is that of Gen Z, their social media platforms. The first one that they go to, it's YouTube, and then it's Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, in that order. And then on the YouTube platform, it's over 70% of the viewership on YouTube is done on a mobile device. So with that in mind, our average show is between about 10 and 14 minutes long, goes along with the attention span, and also because we're on YouTube, which is a free to access platform, you can go from your computer to your phone without needing to log in or anything. It's very easy to access. So, we make access easy, and then we make the content in terms of the duration long enough to have a storyline that everyone can connect to, but not too long where we lose interest. And so and then outside of that, the fact that I touched on it a little bit earlier, but that we've created this kind of universe in the Brat world, we strategically will have one main lead from one show do a cameo in another show, and then the viewership will skyrocket because one person did one line in a show. And sorry, I meant to break down a little bit more, but our kids, a lot of them weren't actors first, they were social media influencers, so they're kind of built-in marketing and distribution, which is why those cameos have the effect that they do for us. And then the other thing, because we're on YouTube, our writer's room and our marketing team are in our comments and take note of that. And the actors, because they engage so much with their fans on their platforms, they also weigh in quite a bit, and everybody seems to have a vested interest outside of a paycheck, because as you may have gathered, we're not paying them that much, but they all enjoy being in our ecosystem. So right now we have 15 shows as part of our slate, and we do appointment viewing, so 3 p.m. school days, people tune in. Last week we had over 7 million views, and we only put out 3 new episodes, so people are regurgitating our content. But so it's their engagement levels that my our revenue is mostly through partnerships outside of the YouTube ad revenue, but we also do product placement, and we'll do bespoke commercials with, say, an actor in the show will then be a part of the commercial that runs as pre-roll. And our fans oddly enjoy seeing their favorite star in that same show in the commercial before, and sometimes the comment feed is more about the commercial than the episode, because they like seeing someone elevated to this brand partnership. We've done things with Extra, Subway, Netflix, Nike, Adidas. So it's just, there's a lot of ownership on our end, and that kind of goes to Gen Z, and them they kind of have a BS meter, and they're loyal to a fault, but then once you've kind of tried to pull anything on them, you lose them. So our whole thing is kind of consistency and authenticity, and people keep coming back, so we're kind of continuing to produce in that way.
So you mentioned that the writers are in the comments, and this is the first time we've been able to really gather data about viewing habits, because of technology, in a real way, where the amount of data we're collecting is massive, larger than ever before. So Eva, what are some of your thoughts with respect to how data is playing into producing content, or maybe some of the challenges or potential problems that we're facing with this collection of data that's allowing us to personalize content?
It's really interesting, and it's really varied, especially across countries. A lot of digital exploitations are not only domestic, but they're also international, and the laws really vary by jurisdiction, not only about what information you can collect, but how it's stored and how it can be disseminated and distributed. So, that's really interesting, and it's ever evolving. GDPR just became a really hot topic in the last couple of years, and I feel that everywhere you go, everyone is using this word GDPR, and not everyone really understands what it means. It has a lot of implications, whether it's one thing included in that is fair remuneration for people. It's really interesting because it really is far-reaching and isn't just about data analytics and collection of information. But once you have the information, it's really key to see how it can be used. So I think Netflix did a really good job. They were the test case, as they had such a direct relationship with their consumers, and we're seeing how people were consuming data and what data was created for exploitation. That's how they, I think, came up with House of Cards, as they saw people like political thrillers, people like Kevin Spacey. I think that's how Adam Sandler got his output deal with them and made a bunch of movies just for Netflix. So I think as people are becoming more and more aware of how data can inform creative decisions about the production and distribution of content, they're really keen on collecting that data. I think it's really interesting, especially in a digital setting, to see how the system evolves, because a lot of these companies are coming up with very niche exploitations, but I think it's really going to be interesting as more and more companies arise to see how they're going to stay attractive to that audience. And I think it's really interesting. Lionsgate, we tried a couple of OTT platforms, some more successful than others, and we've found a lot of success with bundling those platforms. So we'll bundle Stars with our Pantaya platform, which Pantaya is the niche OTT that serves a Hispanic American community. And so we found a lot of success with bundling, and I think that's what a lot of people are finding a lot of success with. But I do think it's interesting. How do you guys use?
Sure. So we are pretty light in terms of any data outside of what our platforms pass through. We don't collect much data just because we are a very nimble place, and in terms of handling data and using it properly, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of procedures to follow and whatnot. So we try to take more of a pedestrian approach with it, and then that's why we're in the comments and taking feedback in that sense. But what we've seen for our model is we are able to, even simple measurements like level of engagement and whatnot, we have the brand partners who, for us, have a hard time reaching some of these demographics. Just seeing the very pedestrian statistics of engagement, we're able to sell deals based on that and screen grabs of interactions and whatnot. So it's kind of funny, we're operating this. People act like it's kind of no man's land, that they don't understand it. But if you can package it in a way and use what's in front of you, we've been able to have success in a non-traditional way in that regard.
Speaking of no man's land, when your client comes, sorry not to be asking
No,
questions, but when
fine.
your clients come to you with some out there ideas or something that you're not especially familiar with, how do you adapt to that or stay nimble to it? Because I know on my side, my clients come to me with ideas that sound completely out of left field, and I have to be adaptable and figure out, no, this actually is a good business model and this can make money. And so it's often challenging for me as they're coming to me with different ideas or areas of exploitation to conceive that this could be something that we should actually lean into.
Sure. So, as opposed to if everyone's familiar with other companies that are similar to us, we like to say that we're an IP-first company, and there is a lot of thought in how kind of our episodes and shows all work together in this universe that we've created. But at the same time, we need to make money and keep the lights on, so we'll sell integrations and whatnot. But we kind of draw the line in the sense of we kind of have two tiers of IP, where if there's an idea of a brand and it's just, we only have a 10 to 14 minute window, so placements in anything are, I don't want to say obvious, but they matter in a bigger sense. They don't just, people don't just see them and then forget about them, because it can be a good portion of our shows. So we kind of, if it's an integration that doesn't make sense for us or a pre-roll that's just not what our brand is, we will offer we do a lot of campaign stuff on Instagram and an IGTV episode, or if it's a pre-roll that after the campaign window ends, it's going to get pulled and not be a part of our IP forever. We're kind of okay with taking a bit of a deviation if it's just going to live for a shorter amount of time. And because we're producing so much content on a continuous basis, if we strike out on one thing, our audience is a little forgiving, because they're going to get another episode the next day of another show that they're in love with, and then we take note to not do it again. So we kind of priority first in terms of our overall sense, and then we'll try to make some exceptions now and then.
So what do we think is next in terms of production and the next frontier, technology assisting in production? What do you see sort of shifting in that space? Maybe I'll kick it off to Jonathan.
Sure. I think one of the things we're starting to see across the board, both from traditional studios as well as newer entrants to the space, is a more nimble approach to production in terms of length and format. Quibi, obviously, as an entrant and a licensee, an acquirer of content, is doing business with a number of the companies. And so a lot of traditional companies like ours are needing to figure out very quickly how to get away from the more traditional 30-minute or 60-minute format into a 7-minute format, which tells a story in a narrative way. And so I think we're we're going to see more and more of that the narrative arcs are going to change and lengths and formats are going to change. What I don't know that we're going to see quite as much of is sort of a user choice, choose your ending, control the narrative yourself type of
The
trend.
Bandersnatch type.
Exactly, in part because I think we've seen some of that story before. 15 years ago when YouTube first came on the scene, we were all told that that marked the death of professionally produced content. And that instead of watching professionally produced content, people instead would be watching dogs on skateboards and we'd all be out of business. Instead, I think what we're seeing is the demand for professionally produced content happily is greater than ever. In a number of different ways and a number of different markets, and the markets are becoming more segmented, which is why there is more of an appetite for daily episodes, short form stuff, as well as an ongoing appetite in other demographics for the more traditional formats. So I think the notion of distinct formats is really going to collapse, and I think content producers are going to need to be nimble enough to really produce content in more of a bespoke way, depending on the audience or the platform.
So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. When we were talking about Quibi, I wanted to move into the next topic of distribution and deal making. Quibi is obviously doing short form content, and in short form content, we've seen it be the most successful in the ad-supported business model space. And it seems like there is just a renaissance going on right now with the AVOD business model. We've seen Pluto being acquired by Viacom for, I think it was $300 million. We've seen the success of Tubi TV. We haven't seen AVOD be so successful. So what do you think is going on here in the AVOD space? Is the economics working here? Is there something that has made the AVOD space now successful that hadn't been working in the past? Free for all for anyone.
I'll jump in on that. I think part of what we may be seeing is a little bit of an over-proliferation of subscription-based services, so that people are bombarded with all of these potential packages when in a lot of ways it's so much easier to consume content without necessarily deciding what paid platform you're going to subscribe to, how many subscriptions of those subscriptions you're going to have. AVOD's very simple. There's no cost or transactional burden on the viewer, and the only downside I think from a content producer and from a platform standpoint is the volatility of the advertising markets. The beauty of a lot of the subscription-based models is they take you out of that kind of volatility and put you in a direct transactional relationship with your viewers. The revenue in an AVOD model obviously flows differently because you're dependent on advertising and on a robust advertising market.
Yeah, and the thing that I thought was really interesting that Clint has told me, and I'll kick it over to you, is one thing that makes your guys' model really successful in the ad space is these bespoke ads that you're creating that your audience actually enjoys. So can you tell us a little bit about those advertisements and how people are responding to them?
Sure. So in terms of we're part of, there's probably about, I'm probably selling a little short, but 10 to 15 brands on YouTube, Condé Nast and us and a handful of others, where they're able to pick the ad inventory that's served against their content on YouTube, and then average user can't do that, so they're just subject to kind of this, the term, but it's this YouTube backfill. Anyhow, there's not much strategy behind it, and versus we're able to kind of target and pick brands and whatnot that our audience isn't going to necessarily be annoyed by. And for us too, seeing that our content is only on a free-to-consumer platform, there seems to be a higher tolerance knowing I have to watch this pre-roll ad or whatnot to get the content. And then coupled with the fact that we are being strategic and often making the ads ourselves that then get placed against the shows, we've gotten a much warmer reception, and that doesn't seem to be a hurdle for us, seeing as though we are only on AVOD platforms. But also separately, what's interesting is when we had originally 2 years back considered where we would go after YouTube, we had thought it would be for some upfront licensing fee on some SVOD, but in reality, we just signed a deal with a couple of people, but they're all AVOD deals with just ad rev split, and it's been an interesting hurdle because there is some back end that you have to do to be able to get, everybody has different delivery requirements, but we have no large licensing fee up front to kind of offset these costs with. So now we're thinking the best approach is incur the cost up front and then get on as many AVOD platforms as you can to justify the cost, because a lot of them have very similar delivery requirements. So it's just been an interesting, people don't need to offer these upfronts, and because of our kind of, we're not premium content per se from a traditional sense or for anyone in our age groups, but for our consumers and whatnot, people aren't willing to pay these fees outside of AVOD deals at this point. So it's kind of a, scorched earth mentality instead, which has been an interesting thing for us to just kind of realize.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's really interesting about the distribution space is just, rights and different rights that you need to acquire in order to distribute on these different platforms. And something that I thought that Eva brought up on one of our calls that was really interesting was how that's affecting ancillary rights. So if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. As content is being distributed, and especially formats are being sold or worldwide content deals are being made, it's interesting to see what is included in those sales. I looked it up before we came, and Friends, it sounds like they just did a sale to HBO Max, which is launching in 2020, for about $425 million. Seinfeld was $500 million for 5 years of global rights to Netflix, and Big Bang Theory was around $600 million and included cable plus streaming. Also on HBO Max. So it's really interesting what these packages include, whether it's just streaming rights or whether it actually includes the sale of content. As there are distributions internationally, it's really interesting to see how they delineate between the formats and how they're going to be tracking all of these sales, and it's, I think, pretty interesting.
And tell us a little bit more about Apple Arcade and Xbox Games Pass. Those, I think, are newer platforms that some folks haven't heard of or aren't as familiar with.
Yeah, in a gaming space, it's actually been really interesting. I handle a student Lionsgate's ancillary rights exploitations, and so have been working on games for the company since about 2012. So in the last 7 years, things have really, really evolved. Everything was really traditional gaming exploitation, so PC, console, and mobile. Then VR became a thing, and so that became a platform. And each individual platform poses different rights complexities because you have additional SKUs, you have different exclusivity windows and different exclusivity obligations within different territories. Game rights are also particularly interesting in that it's really difficult to bifurcate between different territories in terms of the rights that you're getting to make a game based off of IP. So whenever we're dealing with acquisitions and the acquisitions of TV or film content, game rights are really important for us to acquire on a worldwide basis, because if you're going to start geo-restricting game companies and saying, oh, we only have US rights, it's really, really difficult to do so because you really just do need worldwide rights. In terms of these new platforms that are emerging, there are new platforms that are coming out that are SVOD platforms for games, which is actually really, really interesting. And so now, as we're thinking about game rights and game exploitations, we're seeing more and more frequently that gaming companies or developers are asking for streaming rights, and we're now treating them as its own separate bucket of rights. We did that recently. We had a game come out based off the Blair Witch Project, and we delineated between streaming rights and PC rights. It started as a PC console game and then went on mobile, and now is potentially going to be going on a streaming service. So it is really interesting as people come and ask for additional rights. It's just a new era.
Yeah, and streaming rights and all these different rights with respect to distribution can get really, really hairy, and it changes the deal-making structure. So I thought this was a good time to shift gears a little bit and talk about a hairy situation that came up.
Yeah, talk about being the death of all fun. So one of the things we wanted to do is just very briefly walk through a case study in what can happen on multi-platform but affiliated company distribution when it goes wrong. And that's the the lesson of the Bones arbitration, which, as I suspect everybody read in the trades and elsewhere, resulted initially in a 9-figure arbitration award against Fox for the distribution of Bones. And one of the challenges that Fox faced is they were distributing Bones on a number of affiliated platforms, their own broadcast network, affiliated broadcast platforms in the international space, and also, and certainly informative for purposes of the streaming rights analysis, on Hulu, which has been a joint venture in various configurations between the primary, the major studios. And like a number of studios thinking about streaming exploitation of pre-existing property, Fox was faced with an old profit definition that defined its obligations to its profit participants. And the relevant language that was at the center of the arbitration was a provision that said Fox agrees, and Fox, for purposes of this definition, is Fox the studio. Fox agrees that Fox's transactions with affiliated companies, so this would include its own network, these international platforms, as well as Hulu, will be on monetary terms comparable to the terms on which the affiliated company enters into similar transactions with unrelated third-party distributors for comparable programs. So it's a tough and in a lot of ways very subjective standard, because you get into the question of comparable terms, and you also get into the question of comparable programs. And the challenge for anybody trying to apply a definition like that is the fact that oftentimes deal terms are not comparable apples to apples, and probably more importantly, professionally produced content isn't fungible. There's not necessarily a direct comparison, so it's very hard to fulfill that definition. The challenge that Fox faced is that the record in the arbitration established that the people responsible for setting the license fees between the various Fox entities didn't even consult the definition, and that they didn't apply any of the data that the definition would have required. Because when you pare the definition down, what it really would have required somebody at the studio to do if they were licensing episodes, for example, to Hulu, would be to say, okay, what is Hulu paying unaffiliated studios for comparable programming? Bones is a 1-hour drama. Let's see what other studios' 1-hour dramas are going for to Hulu if there's an arm's length relationship, and we'll use that as an anchor or at least a comp for purposes of the setting of our license fee and the determination of how much money flows down to the profit participants. What the record showed is that they didn't do that. So not only did they have a definition that was tough to apply because of some of these terms, but unfortunately, ultimately for Fox, the record also showed that they didn't even try to apply it. And so there was testimony that the executives involved had never tried to gather any of this third-party data to determine what the license fee should be. So that's why we saw really sort of a perfect storm, I think, in terms of what happened to Fox in the Bones arbitration. The good news is that that kind of result should be avoidable. And I think lesson number one coming out of it is, even in a fast-paced world, and even in a context of distribution on new platforms, the first question that anybody asks should be, what does our definition say and what are our obligations to the third-party profit participants? So let's go back to that and make sure that the way we're setting up the economics for the streaming, for example, on an affiliated service is faithful to that definition. There may be times where it's cumbersome and hard to apply. There may be times where, in fact, you have to go back to the third-party participants and say, look, we're struggling to apply this definition. We have the option of running your content on the service or not. If that's something you're interested in, we may need to clarify this. But even if you're not doing that, at least using the definition as a starting point is important. What we're starting to see, particularly with Disney Plus, and there's been a lot of coverage of this, is Disney is advocating changing the paradigm on profit participation in professionally produced content and essentially buying out those rights up front, so that once they move into the launch of Disney Plus, we won't see the traditional studio accounting where you need to sort of see the money flow through the waterfall, and how much the profit participants get is determined by that. So I think, Netflix obviously, for its own reasons, was one of the first to do that. Disney is really the first traditional studio moving to that sort of model and saying to profit participants, look, we'll pay you more up front, but in return for that, you're not going to get the same sort of point structure as you might under a more traditional definition. So I think the Fox case is a cautionary tale for everybody. The decision's public, even though it was in arbitration. The plaintiffs, the profit participants in that case, Emily Deschanel and David Boreanaz and others, filed a motion to confirm that arbitration award in LA Superior Court. So you can Google the case, you can read the decision, you can see where things went wrong. But again, I think the biggest lesson is, regardless of how new the exploitation is, if you're contemplating distributing programming on an affiliated platform, make sure the starting point for the analysis is the profit participation definition and the obligations that you might have to participants.
Super interesting. And to me, one of the things that this showed, and this arbitration happened a few years ago, was almost a signal that folks weren't taking the streaming space as seriously, that there wasn't real money to be made there. And we can see from this arbitration that clearly there's a lot of money to be made in the space, and now it's really dominating the space. This is the new version of television, essentially. So we've really seen this shift in attitude as well. And with respect to deal making, as these new platforms come along and as we evolve in making these deals, you have to figure out how these things work. And at first it's new, it's precedent setting, and then as time goes on, it becomes industry standard. So have you guys seen any new shifts or sort of challenges in the deal-making space itself, or just things that have now become industry standard that we all can agree to that were maybe problems in the past? To anyone.
Sure. Jonathan, it's funny, you were describing kind of my company's current predicament in the sense that before our largest round of funding, in the beginning when we were paying people very little, we were offering, profit participation if we ever leave the YouTube platform and whatnot, and, it was all kind of no one defined anything very well, and it was off-platform, but it was very vague, and we get to the place where now that we're considering these licensing deals, it's, do we have to factor this into this cost, especially when it's an AVOD deal, and you're like, there's nothing up front to automatically apply against. Anyway, so in a couple of occasions, we've gone back and said, hey, we know this needs to be a clearer statement. Can we agree to what this actually means? And people have been amenable, but at the same time, knowing that you've left kind of that gray area on the table when you have another deal coming down is a bit of and that just goes to this, we're only 2-3 years old in the sense that streaming even then off of our current platform wasn't even seen as this, because we were going to have, an influx of a licensing fee to offset any gray deal. So now what we're doing as a transition, and we're more traditional in the sense that paying a little more upfront, back end's not even on the table unless you're a legacy deal who got some in the beginning, and we're, from an accounting perspective and just because we want to be on so many platforms, having to keep up with the participations at a company like ours with a 60-person head count, no one wants to really be involved, so.
Impossible.
Yeah. It's hard, and there's a lot of infrastructure that it takes. We have an entire department of people who do nothing but participation statements and applying definitions and the like. I think everybody is looking for a way to simplify to some extent. So I think at the deal-making stage, when projects are developed, I think increasingly people will try to move away from back end just because it can be so difficult. It still, to some degree, is the holy grail in success, and that's why the numbers in the Bones arbitration were so big. But yet at the same time, if somebody has the option of kind of buying that lottery ticket with back end or taking more upfront and not having that profit participation interest, the incentives are changing a little bit. One of the things, Tracey, in response to your question in terms of how deals are changing, I think increasingly as a broadcast network, we're looking at the acquisition of rights not just as a network right anymore. So, for example, when we license programming in from third parties, our expectation is that's going to include a full stack on our digital service. So a network license fee no longer covers just a broadcast the way that it once did. Now, when programming is licensed, there's an understanding that we've got to be able to deliver it to the audience wherever the audience is. So you're seeing widening windows of network exclusivity from a platform standpoint, and an expectation that when programming is licensed in from third parties, it's going to include at least some streaming window.
All right. I'm going to shift entirely now to keep you all on your toes. And one of the main technologies that people have talked about over the last few years is, of course, virtual reality and augmented reality. And probably 3 years ago, everyone was real fired up on this space. We saw that consoles were first coming to market, and it was the first time that virtual reality was going to be in people's homes, and we could actually commercialize this product and see where it could go. I think we've seen things simmer down in that space a little bit, or people getting not as excited with where we are. It's still early days, and even our lunchtime speaker was speaking about it a little bit, but there's still a lot of movement happening in this space. People are still playing in it. We're still getting some traction here. So Eva, you at Lionsgate are doing a lot of stuff with respect to location-based VR. Tell me what's happening.
Yeah, so I think the industry, especially from a studio perspective, has really evolved in terms of the way that it interacts with AR and VR. At Lionsgate and a lot of other studios, they were using AR and VR both as promotional and marketing tools. That's how it really started prior to the studio interaction. A lot of that changed with The Martian, which was a VR experience that was created as a promotional tool, but then started being sold to consumers. And at Lionsgate, we were really proud to have done one of the first VR games that was based off of pre-existing IP with our John Wick game, which came out a number of years ago. We also did an AR app to promote the theatrical release of our film, The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1, a number of years ago, and it was before Pokemon Go came out, and it was really innovative for what it was. It was a geo-tracking app where you go to a location and you tag yourself, and it was really interactive. In terms of the things that we're doing now, location-based VR is very, very successful. Just as a consumer, I know I live in the Valley. Across the street is Castle Park, and I take my 8-year-old nephew there all the time. There is a $7 per person upcharge for this VR experience, and the 8-year-old kid, he loves to do it over and over and over. Unfortunately, my budget is a little limited, so my husband and I will take him, and we'll do it maybe twice, and that's about it. But it really is finding a lot of success in a location-based setting. There are VR arcades that are popping up all over the world, really, and they're very, very popular, especially outside the U.S. and in the U.S. as well. There are companies like The Void and Dreamscape that are really, really popularizing location-based VR. The Void now has about 20 locations and is constantly expanding, and they've worked with other third-party IPs to create integrated content. There's a location out in Santa Monica, and it's really, really fun. You go through a whole experience, and it's really, really exciting. So the photo you guys are looking at right now is from a theme park that we just opened in China a couple of months ago. There are a number of VR and AR activations within the park. One particular challenge that we had with this particular location is that there wasn't a lot of square footage, because it's an indoor theme park and it's part of an overall entertainment complex, and the square footage was a lot more limited than a traditional park, and so it really challenged us to be creative with the types of experiences that we were able to come up with. So we were able to figure out ways of creating rides. Like, this is an AR divergent training experience. You go and you stand, and it's similar in concept to Dance Dance Revolution and Guitar Hero, in that you stand and you fight and you can interact with other people. We also have a Twilight VR coaster, and we came up with a queue scenario for the line while guests are waiting to enter the ride in a really creative way that maximized space capacity, and then combined AR and VR technology for that particular ride. So you're sitting on a recreated motorcycle, which actually moves, and while you're within that experience, you are interacting with other people, which is actually one of the really exciting things about VR and newer VR technologies in that you're able to interact with people more frequently, which I think was one drawback of the at-home consumer experience, was that it was very insular and solo and you weren't able to interact with other people. So we were able to build that mechanic into our Twilight ride. This photo is of our Hunger Games VR ride, and it's just a really interesting setting. We're finding that VR arcades are popping up all over the world and having a lot of success. This is our Gods of Egypt VR coaster. So it's a physical roller coaster, and you put on your VR goggles. We worked with our licensee to develop a really interesting mechanic, which is that there are, similar to 3D glasses, there are these glasses that you put onto the front of it, but it makes it really clean and easy to, after everyone gets off the ride, they put it in a bin. It's easier to clean, similar to 3D glasses, whereas most VR technologies are a little bit challenging to clean. I know at least at Castle Park, they have wipes that usually run out, and it's not as exciting when someone else just had it on. So VR definitely does have its challenges, and we're still figuring everything out. But from a location-based setting, there is a lot of success that can happen. I know in terms of theme parks and theme park settings, Disney's been doing a really good job with aggregating information. They've got their wristbands. They're doing a really interesting thing in terms of their Star Wars hotel that's coming out, in terms of collecting data and really customizing a user experience in a theme park setting. So that's really interesting as well.
Absolutely, and the one thing that you mentioned about the social aspect of location VR is something that I find really interesting and exciting about location VR in particular, because we have heard that, we all know, we've seen the data that technology is isolating, it's keeping people in their homes, not interacting with people, and I think this is a great way. It sort of really speaks to what the studio does best in terms of going out to the movies, and this is sort of going out to this new experience and experiencing the properties that you love in this new way, and really kind of being able to interact with them in real life, and just gives fans a deeper engagement with the characters and with the stories, and keeps people out and together socializing but still enjoying technology, which is probably the most difficult balance that we are facing with all this new technology that's coming. Is anyone else playing in the VR and AR space on the panel that we want to talk about?
I think there's always an interest in the possibility of that tie-in. We haven't seen a lot of that, but again, our franchises aren't the same as Hunger Games or the other ones that Lionsgate has that really lend themselves to what sounds like are some really cool experiences.
Eve, I have a question for you. Are you looking at kind of the spends that you're, in instance, doing this roller coaster and whatnot? Is it a marketing spend, or do you guys see it in any way as like a revenue increaser? How is it? I'm just wondering on a studio side how it's viewed.
Yeah, our structure is a licensing structure, so we find a licensee. It's a traditional licensing structure, so we're not investing in this particular theme park. In terms of the rides that we choose or the IP that we choose to exploit, Gods of Egypt wasn't a particularly profitable film. It had some challenges at the box office, but we found that there was a really interesting way that we could create an elevating consumer experience. And, we're bringing new life to the property in a way that we're really careful not to be exploitative. We really want to make sure that there's a reason for being. Why are we doing this? And so we're really lucky in that we do have a lot of franchise titles, but at the same time, we're really thoughtful about what we're doing with them, and we're really trying to make sure that as we're thinking of different exploitations for them, we're creating a new consumer experience that, again, just elevates the brand. Yeah.
So another new technology that's on the rise here, and I guess I wouldn't call it new because it's really old, but one thing that I wanted to bring up that is very, very popular is podcasting. So podcasting is essentially just radio, right? Radio back in the day, but with the advent of these digital platforms, with podcasting platforms, it's really garnered the attention of massive audience. So are you guys playing in the podcasting space? I know, Clint, you had mentioned.
Yeah, we have a podcast coming out in a couple weeks. It'll be our first go at it, and we're working with this company called Art19, which is more or less the whole business of podcasting and YouTube and all of these spaces is dealing with kind of the ad servers and figuring out CPMs and partners and all of that. So the back end of it all, while podcasts seem great and fun, that whole back end is a bit of a nightmare. So there's companies like Art19 who then pull from iTunes and Spotify and other podcast hosts to make that an easier process for you. And they'll source the ad inventory for you as well so that you don't have to do the placement. So we're just treating it as an extension of our universe, not a show specific, but kind of using some of our more well-articulate kids who just, it's another extension of our brand. Sure, some additional revenue would be nice, but we also have a music companies we have a guy who will make tracks that they'll release on Spotify and iTunes with some of our stars who've never sang before. So we're kind of looking at and we have a merch department of one, so it's another kind of avenue to kind of add to the experience in our universe, but the revenue is a bit TBD, so we will see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem for a lot of people in the podcasting space, but it seems like the early days of digital video where it wasn't monetizable, people were trying to figure it out, and then eventually there was some traction, we were moving forward, and it's a great way to, like you said, another extension of IP portfolio property, whether it goes from, the video to a podcast, I've seen that done, or the opposite, where it starts as a podcast and then it goes to the TV space. So another really interesting space to play in.
Like Dirty John, that's a success
Oh,
story,
fantastic.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a success.
Exactly.
And Homecoming as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
Exactly. All right, so as a final question here, what can we expect for the future? What is sort of the next technologies that are going to disrupt the studio business or that are exciting that we're looking forward to in terms of what's coming down the pipe? I'll just go down the line. Eva?
I just think as technology evolves, I think that everyone needs to be adaptable. Also, there's tons of M&A in the entertainment industry, as was touched on before. And I think as businesses rise above the noise and become successful, they will be acquired more and more frequently. And then I think it's about maintaining adaptability in terms of continuing to find success. In terms of technology, I'm not particularly sure, but I think that some of the models that we were talking about earlier in terms of streaming and bundling, I think are going to be the way of the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all with you in the sense that I think the name of the game is adaptability, and the struggle with that is how much money do we put forth in this current model so that if we need to shift, we can do so without it being an epic loss, and that we're able to make the shift. And I think with that, I think we will have a lot more consolidation. And even as a consumer, it's not related to technology, but the amount of individual a la carte streaming platforms I even now subscribe to, it's getting a little ridiculous. And you're hoping the end is near, but it seems to be the opposite, that it's just ramping up. So I mean, that's something I would like to change, but we'll see. But technology-wise, I do think we will kind of continue to have kind of the two players, in the sense that I look at a company like mine where we are capitalizing on the low cost of technology to make content, but that serves a certain demographic and appetite versus more traditional high quality Quibi type content, which serves a different demographic. And I think that'll be kind of an interesting divide that only increases as we go on.
I would just echo what Clint and Eva have already said. I do think there's likely to be some sorting out and aggregation. I don't think there's going to be an unlimited appetite on the part of consumers for all of these subscription-based services. But again, I think the good news is that there does seem to be a sustained appetite for professionally produced content of various types, and people are watching more content than ever before. So hopefully for all of us, that'll continue.
Absolutely. And my 2 cents, I think that'll just be some deeper personalization with respect to content, deeper customized content, more niche content, because now you don't necessarily have to hit mass audiences to be able to monetize the content and do well. You can hit a really engaged fan base and do really well in that direction. So with that, I will open it to questions. Dave. So the question is, with respect to net neutrality being repealed, how is that going to affect business models?
I'll take a stab at it. I think, look, it certainly presents a concern to the extent that certain type of traffic can be favored over others. And to some extent, it takes the control away from the viewer and could prioritize certain pipes above others. Having said that, I think there's still going to be a significant, if not completely dispositive factor based on audience demand. So, net neutrality or not, I think people are going to want to watch what they want to watch, and they'll find a way to get it.
Chris.
I can take this. So for a lot of our AVOD deals, we've seen it where there's kind of two options in the sense that the platform will serve all of the ads, and it'll be a straight 50-50 split. And then at other times, they'll give us the option to fill a certain percentage that we're comfortable taking on, and then we can sell at a higher CPM and reap a little bit more benefits. But it is like what you said, the challenge of who's administering that. And for a company like my size, we tend to take the former situation because we don't want to get involved in the administering of it as much. And in terms of profit participation and whatnot, it depends on your definition of who's involved and whatnot, and we're avoiding that in the sense of we carve out in a handful of our deals, AVOD deals as a whole. It's if we get an SVOD or a big licensing, or we go onto a traditional platform where that kind of comes into play. So it's not as applicable for me, maybe. I don't know, Jonathan, if...
No, I would say, look, there are a number of different deals, and you may see a place where AVOD evolves similar to the way that the television marketplace has evolved in syndication, especially, where there are some parties who would prefer to actually take the inventory and sell the content themselves. You see that increasingly on cable television on a time-buy basis, for example. So I think there's certainly the possibility of that if that's a company with the capability of selling it. That's still a effort-intensive business. And so if you have a company that produces content and sees themselves as a potential successful seller of ad inventory, you could certainly see that type of deal emerge.
I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much.